The Daleks Master Plan is one of Doctor Who's most significant stories, there's no doubt about that, yet, in a way, I feel its significance within the culture of Doctor Who itself is actually pretty limited. The most iconic elements of the story among fandom, Marvick Chen, Sara Kingdom, the Time Destructor, they're all probably at a bit of a second tier. Compared with the first two Dalek stories with their iconic imagery of the Daleks in their city and then in London, or hell, even the other two Dalek stories of the decade we've yet to do, I Am Your Servant and The Dalek Emperor have places within the minds of Doctor Who fans in a way that no specific element from this story really does. The idea of the Daleks Master Plan is iconic, but the actual elements of the story itself? Somewhat ironically, the one moment that does transcend this is the Doctor turning around and wishing everyone a Merry Christmas. It sometimes does take the truly absurd to stick in the memory. Now, this is obviously a product of circumstance and requires looking at this story as circumstance to understand. Bringing back the Daleks for Season 3 was a pretty obvious course, and apparently it was originally a 6-part story to the story that was planned, but BBC executives demanded the length be doubled so they could have more Daleks. They, after all, were the show's great pull. Now, putting together a story of such length will present challenges even at the best of times. Remember, the only other season with stories longer than 7 episodes was Season 6, when they had a severe shortage of scripts and needed to stretch stories out for that reason. The Trial of a Time Lord is technically longer, of course, but that was several productions joined together rather than one big one like this story. This was compounded by the fact that Terry Nation was unable to write the whole story due to other commitments, so former script editor Dennis Spooner had to write many of the episodes. Nation wrote the first 5, plus episode 7, while Spooner wrote episode 6, then from episode 8 until the end. So already they had 2 writers working on a story with a length that defied common sense, but behind the scenes issues were making things much worse. Verity Lambert had moved on after steering the show steadily for its first 2 seasons, in fact Mission to the Unknown was her last story, and her replacement was John Wills. Wills' rotation is not great, and while this was a long time ago, and we won't ever be hearing his side of the story, it's difficult to look at what we do now and not come to the conclusion that it's probably deserved. See, early on in the season, Maureen O'Brien had complained about a script, which had led Wills to not renew her contract. This immediately set the rest of the cast, and particularly William Hartnell, against Hills, so now on top of everything else they had to deal with on-set antagonism. Wills only did 2 more stories after this one, purportedly because his relationship with Hartnell had become so bad that the BBC lost patience and sacked him. Even worse, the removal of Vicky from the show meant that there was a gap in the companion roster. Initially they brought in the Trojan handmaiden Katarina, but for reasons I'll discuss later she would have to be killed off during this story, and a replacement brought in only for this story. And if all that wasn't enough, it was realised episode 7 of the story would be broadcast on Christmas Day, so an episode of no consequence had to be inserted in so those not watching on Christmas wouldn't miss anything, completely interrupting the story. So with a laundry list of problems they had to go and make a story that ended up as the best part 6 hours long. All of this is of course compounded by the fact that these days the story is partially missing. It does have one of the more interesting and frankly bizarre tales of all the missing stories. First of all, it was marketed to be sold abroad as an 11-parter, with the Christmas episode 7 excluded. It was long time posited that because of this the episode was never recorded onto 16mm film and was therefore lost forever and the videotape was wiped, but more recently it's been thought it was in fact telerecorded with the rest of the story. I frankly always thought it was a bit odd they wouldn't. If they recorded the pilot episode of all things, an episode that was definitely never going to be sold overseas, or indeed have anything at all done with it, then I fail to see why this episode would have been excluded. It's pretty academic really, it adds a few years onto the existence of the episodes, and it was certainly lost when the negatives were destroyed in the early 70s, but it's a point to bring up. In any case, the 11-part story was offered to Australia, whose censors viewed it and rejected it as uncensorable, so the ABC were not able to broadcast it. While the process of selling Doctor Who overseas defies simple explanation, the short answer is that most of the Commonwealth countries, the main buyers of BBC content, relied on Australia to cover several of the clearance costs because of complicated agreements with various unions and stuff. Without the Aussies to do that, the story was too expensive to be bought by other, less financially well-off broadcasters in other countries. This was compounded by Terry Nation withdrawing the Dalek stories from sale throughout 1967 while he was trying to sell his own spin-off series in America, meaning that by the time he lifted that, most of the countries showing Season 3 had simply skipped over the story and moved on with the series. This all had 2 effects. Firstly, that as I said in the Mission to the Unknown review, these are the only 2 stories never broadcast overseas at all, and as they were never repeated, only ever shown once on their initial UK broadcast. Secondly, and far more importantly, this relates to the number of prints ever made and the missing and existing episodes. There are 2 possibilities for how many sets of prints were ever made for the story, 1 or 2. 1 in that they went to Australia, were rejected, came back and sat on the shelves after that, or 2 in that the first set went to Australia, came back and was immediately junked, and the second sat on the shelves the whole time. Personally, I don't see why they'd have struck 2 sets when if they desperately needed a second set they could have struck them from the negatives, which still existed at the time, and weren't junked for a good few years after that. So I think there was just one set of prints, which then sat at the BBC for several years after they came back from Down Under. Episode 3 was still around in the early 70s for a clip to be used in Blue Peter, and episode 4 was exactly the same, the copy of which famously disappeared when Blue Peter took it, and has led to confusion with episode 4 of The 10th Planet. And for the record, no, episode 4 of that story was never disappeared by Blue Peter, but episode 4 of this story definitely was. If it was nicked by someone rather than junked, it may still exist, and that's why it's usually a candidate whenever the missing episodes that supposedly exist in private collections we're always hearing about are brought up. In any case, by the time junking ended in 1978, there were no episodes of this story held. In 1983, episodes 5 and 10 were returned to the BBC, apparently from a Mormon church in London that had found several BBC films including those 2 episodes. This has become a bit of an infamous story, with several contradictory accounts, and much does not make sense. Personally, I think one can simply apply Occam's razor and reach a fairly simple conclusion that the whole story was a load of bollocks, invented to put up a smokescreen protecting a BBC employee who had nicked the prints and was now returning them. This, to me, is made even more plausible by the fact that episode 2 was returned by a former BBC engineer in 2004 who had done exactly that, nicked it back in the day and held on to it. So we do have those 3 full episodes. There are also some short clips from episodes 3 and 4 from the aforementioned Blue Peter episodes that do exist. Blue Peter always had quite a strict archiving policy in contrast to Doctor Who, and there are some film inserts from episode 1. Amusingly, given that it was thought to have been completely lost only a few years after the broadcast until quite recently, episode 7 is the only one with any off-screen photographs taken, not professional telesnaps by John Cura, fairly crude photos taken by one of the actors in the episode. This at least has preserved the still image of the Merry Christmas moment, so I suppose we have that, don't we? Aside from that, and obviously the off-air audio, nothing. Most of season 3 was not telesnapped, so almost all the missing episodes had nothing to represent them. Which, now we've looked at the story's archive status, we need to look at how this affects the watching experience now. Look, I'm not going to sit here and pretend this is an easy story to watch in its present form. It does sound silly, but the presence of telesnaps makes reconstructions that much easier to sit through. Loose Cannon did their best, but the composite images they have to use for non-telesnap stories just remove yet another link to the original production, and make it even harder to follow along with the action and the intent of the piece. I'll at the least say this. Episodes 2, 5 and 10 are spaced out enough to avoid it becoming a total slog. If you watch it in 3 sittings of 4 episodes, you get an actual episode every time, so that is a bit better. As your humble reviewer, such an easy option was not available to me, and so I did all 12, plus Mission in one go, with a quick food and toilet break after episode 5. That was probably a mistake, as I mean I just kind of felt frustrated towards the end. Going through so many missing episodes with so little to go on, it just does become frustrating. It's a shame because it obviously is no way the fault of the makers of the story, it's the fault of the BBC confusing archive and flamethrower, but I would be lying if I said this wasn't clouding my opinion of the story. It is exacerbated by several overall issues I have, and not to give the game away, if the later parts of the story were less repetitive and redundant, it might be a bit easier to deal with. But I did find the story somewhat difficult to get into as much as it maybe deserved. Perhaps if I give them narrated audios a go, I might find it a bit more easier than the visual reconstruction. I will say this. Of the episodes we do have, I think episode 2 is the best to represent the story, being quite an important segment of the early part of the story and showing off many of the production's important elements. Episode 5, on the other hand, feels like a bit of a plot transition episode and not much more, and does feel a bit light on actual substance, especially after episode 4, which was such a packed episode. Episode 10 is probably the best of the later stage filler episodes, but the word filler is still pretty key, especially as it comes before the story finally starts wrapping up. Still, as a snapshot of the production as a whole, these 3 episodes show it off fairly well. Which brings me on to the story itself, and I'll start as I frequently do with the production side. With only 3 episodes and some clips to go on, it's difficult to get the gist of the entire story, but it's enough to get a general idea from. Master Plan was directed by Douglas Camfield, a fairly prolific Who director who continued to direct right up to the Tom Baker era. Camfield generally specialised in stories with a large scope, and his list of credits is quite impressive. The Web of Fear, The Invasion, The Seeds of Doom, and of course, by Who fans, he is best remembered for his spat with Dudley Simpson, which meant Simpson didn't score any of his stories aside from the one where the argument started. What a way to be remembered, eh? Camfield does quite a good job here, and there's no doubt his greatest achievement with this is giving the piece the sense of scale it needs. He's quite creative with his shot choices, and quite a few stand out in my mind. I do like how he uses his shots to emphasise character, particularly with Mavic Chen, and it's a pity we can't see how he deals with this towards the end of Chen's Choo-Choo's journey around the bend. Equally, he does a good job with the Daleks themselves, particularly in episode 2, where there are some great shots of them that really reinforce their stature and menace. Their first appearance in the story, and a surviving film insert from episode 1, is also fantastically shot. The build-up as Kirk Gantry continues to move around knowing that the Daleks are close, and then BAM! Fantastic opening shot of the Daleks shot from below. I also like the way they're shot in parts of episode 10, particularly when they're next to Chen. The fact he's taller than it and he holds his stature gives the impression on the surface he is as high above them as he thinks, but the way the Daleks always take control of the situation means it's very obvious to the viewer how that's not the case. I also particularly like the way that the tension is built up with a great deal of effectiveness. Of the surviving episodes, this is mostly an episode 2 thing, firstly in the scenes in the jungle and then as the Doctor tries to nick the Terranium, but it's partially the case in the latter ones as well. Overall, Camfield does a pretty good job, but he is hampered by the nature of the story when it comes to pacing, as unfortunately, pacing just doesn't really work, it is poor. I don't really blame Camfield for this, it was 12 episodes long and much of the fault lies with the conception of the story rather than anything else, but even just taking the surviving episodes, it kind of drags. Episode 2 does pretty well actually, but episode 5 in particular feels like it just goes in an absolutely glacial place. The script is at fault here, is essentially taking 10 minutes of actual plot and expanding it to 25 minutes with lots of guff about teleporting mice. But it's technically impressive as the scenes with when the Doctor and Stephen and Sara get teleported are, they're just kind of dull. It's a symptom of the overall problem of the story, but too little plot has been stretched out and so much of it feels superfluous and repetitive. But even then, Camfield does what he can with it. I like the shot of the footprints of the invisible aliens appearing, even if the aliens themselves and this entire bit of the plot is just filler. So yeah, Camfield elevates the material that does exist, but if you want a proper example of his work on the series, I'd look at the stories of his that are mostly or entirely complete. Other aspects of the production I think work very well. The sound design is excellent throughout the story. The jungle sounds of Kemble would basically be the template for jungle sounds throughout the rest of the classic run, and I'm pretty sure were actually just used unedited a few times as well. The effects work is pretty solid, and the set design is brilliant throughout. In all 3 surviving episodes I can point to some excellent work, the jungle in episode 2 and the interior of the base in episode 5 for instance, but I think the best example from the surviving material is the Egypt from episode 10, which is insanely well realised. It almost feels like a location shoot, which obviously it isn't, but the fact it feels that way is generally an impressive given the time and budget. It's a fairly stereotypical view of ancient Egypt, of course, but, they had enough to do in this story. Becoming scholars of ancient Egyptian architecture was probably asking a bit too much. The surviving set photos at the end of the story also look quite impressive, and the brutality of the Time Destructor's effects, and god, I can't believe I'm saying this, for the photos we have of episode 7, that looks fairly decent as well. So yeah, the designers actually did quite a good job with this. Tristan Carey, who did the music, also did a great job with some fantastic pieces, a huge improvement over the music from The Chase. I particularly like the using this scene. And the score whenever the Time Destructor is turned on is also very effective in portraying its menace. I'm not sure I call it my favourite 60s soundtrack, but it certainly does a good job of setting the atmosphere. So with production out of the way, let's look at the script. And I will be fair and start with what works, and there is stuff that works. As down as I've been on it so far, or certain elements of it so far, there is a great deal it gets right. Firstly, a strength of the Nation's previous Dalek stories was character. Here it is a bit of a step down for sure, and we'll get to all that, but there is a great deal he's done right with this. Perhaps most importantly, the character of the First Doctor, whom of course had already been well-established character by this juncture, does get a good outing here. The selfish old man we started with is now long gone, replaced by an occasionally bad-tempered but always heroic and fiercely intelligent one. The theme for his character throughout this is his devotion to defeating the Daleks, and how his evolution over the course of the series had led him to such a goal. But in typical First Doctor fashion, he does so with an edge of stubbornness and a refusal to be intimidated. Probably my favourite part of episode 10 is how this is portrayed, with the Doctor's utter and total refusal to be intimidated by the Daleks, and certainly by Chen, just shows how much this is the case. There are small moments throughout the story, such as his early confrontations with Brett, who makes a terrible mistake of telling him to shut up at one point.
Now will you shut up, sir?
Yeah, only one way that was going to end, Brett. I'm surprised he didn't give you a smack over the head with his cane as well. But also featured is how intelligent and crafty the First Doctor has become over these early years. A good scene in episode 4 is when he's able to suss out Brett's friend as going to betray them. But also plays into his morality with how angry he gets with Brett after he shoots the traitor. Ultimately though, this does lead into a major weakness of his. His single-mindedness in doing the heroic thing, whether that being defeating the Daleks or anything else he has to do throughout the story, is clearly causing him to lose sight of some basic humanity. A perfect example of this is the conclusion, where it has to be Stephen to remind him that the human cost of defeating the Daleks is not something to easily forget. But we'll look at this more a bit later. The point is, in this, the First Doctor's final adventure against the Daleks, and arguably his final epic at its height before the long wind down towards the 10th planet begins, his character is on fine form. The other character I think deserves praise is that of Marvik Chen, the big bad of the piece. Chen is a very interesting enigma, the guardian of the solar system who allies himself with the Daleks. On the surface, he's actually fairly straightforward. He's obviously power hungry and ambitious, but it's the way there's far more depth with it initially seems that makes him work so well as a character. Chen's ambition is pretty naked, and it is fairly consuming.
When I am next to the Daleks, only they stand between me and the highest position in the universe.
Yeah, it's not exactly subtle, is it? This leads to two things. Firstly, ego. As the story progresses, he gets more and more delusional about his role and power. While at first he's content to act as the Daleks' subordinate for the time being, he gets more and more resentful of them to the point where he truly believes he is their master. His final delusional rant at the Daleks demanding they obey him, while I look at him thinking what the fuck is this prat going on about, is just really great in this regard. It's fascinating to watch the story go along, and while his relationship with the Daleks never actually changes at all, the way he perceives it constantly does. The Daleks constantly betraying and killing the other delegates as soon as they stop being useful should be a massive warning sign for him, and he just falls more and more into his same delusion. This feeds into the second thing, manipulation. From the start you can see how he's manipulating the other delegates and almost orchestrating their downfall. Indeed, at some points it seems like he's almost manipulating the Daleks themselves, but without realising the Daleks are in their own way manipulating and using him. They want the Terranium off him and nothing else, and they're willing to pretend to placate his ego to get it. Again, because of the ego, he's just too blind to see it. He's clever enough to manipulate the dim-witted delegates, but not clever enough to see the wood for the trees when it comes to the Daleks. It's a fascinating way of looking at the common moustache-twirling villain. He's a power-obsessed nut, but there's a great deal more to it, and that's why it works so well. His eventual fall into delusion and paranoia, which ends with his extermination, is a natural conclusion to the character's arc over the 12 episodes. Kevin Stoney, who Camfield would later cast again to play Tobias Vaughan in The Invasion, a similar but very different character in many ways, does an excellent job with Chen. He makes sure the performance is very subtle in places, and he makes sure Chen almost has a charm about him that makes it very obvious why he rose to such political heights, but also leaving a trail of slime on the screen, so to speak. Chen is a very memorable villain and the highlight of the piece. He is, of course, though, not the main villain of the piece. That honour goes to our favourite Pepper Potts. After a blip of patheticness in the chase, the Daleks are back on form for this story. Aside from the stuff I mentioned earlier about how they are shot, giving them a sense of menace, there's also a subtle sense throughout the story that despite all the squabbling and manipulation amongst the delegates, the Daleks are definitely in complete control. And it works very well as both giving the Daleks an overarching sense of menace and also keeping this as only a background idea rather than outright stating it. It's notable throughout the story that the only one who manages to constantly outsmart the Daleks is the Doctor, which is exactly how you want it, to make their rivalry feel like a titanic battle of wills, rather than whatever the fuck it was we had in the chase. There are one or two moments where it doesn't quite work. The Egyptian fight in episode 10 is a bit pathetic on the Dalek front, but ultimately the overarching feeling we get with the Daleks in this story is that they're truly a menace again. Unlike the Dalek invasion of Earth, where their grand plan was really stupid and lacked any gravitas, their plan here, to use the Time Destructor as an ultimate weapon, is quite effective in its simplicity, and does give real impetus throughout the story. I think writers are quite lucky with the Daleks in that their ultimate aim, to destroy and conquer, is pretty simple, so it's not necessary to have some complicated plan, and several Dalek stories fell into this trap later on. The Daleks want to destroy everything, so they get a big-ass Time Destroyer to do it. I also think the vocal work is actually really good in this. The Daleks get a lot of menace from that. And also I should just quickly point out that in Mission to the Unknown it was very similar, their portrayal, so yeah, overall I think this is a really good portrayal of the Daleks, and back to form, although not quite as good it would later be in the Troughton era stories, I don't think, but, you know, it's still good. In terms of the plot, by far its most effective part is the first 4 episodes, where the story is about continuing the intrigue and threat set up by Mission to the Unknown, and examining the politics of Earth and its repercussions of what's going on with it and Chen's betrayal. This part of the story does a great job of setting up the Daleks' plan, the aims and ambitions of the delegates, Chen's story and his role within Earth, and indeed the political culture of Earth that has allowed him to get such a grip on the political and security establishment. The threat that Daleks feels is most potent throughout this part of the story, and the desperate fight of our heroes becoming ever more difficult and facing ever more obstacles works very well. It's not perfect, and the story structure means that even these parts can feel quite padded, but compared with how later on the story just meanders, it's quite tight and focused and tells its story with quite a bit of vigour. I've already mentioned the scene where Brett's friend is found out as a traitor, but I'd say it's a highlight of this part of the story and represents it really well. The Doctor's uncovering of him, Brett's abject horror that nobody can be trusted, and his killing him in anger that sets up a good confrontation with the Doctor. It's all great stuff. I also find it quite amusing that the end of episode 1 is the point we first find out that Chen is working with the Daleks, which was probably intended as part of the cliffhanger, given that Chen is now pretty universally known as the baddie in this story. The story around the Delegates is also quite effective. I've already mentioned how their gradual demise at the hands of the Daleks is an effective reminder of who's really in charge and Chen's delusion about that, but the ones that have speaking roles all offer interesting contrast to Chen. The most prominent one is probably Zephon, for the reason that he's particularly prominent in episode 2, whereas the others only really matter in episodes that are missing. His arrogance and stubbornness is a very interesting contrast to Chen. Chen is just as delusional about his importance, but he's far more clever and better at hiding his ambitions, whereas Zephon is just a stubborn idiot who ends up getting the whole operation binned by letting the Doctor nab the Terranium. Just like in Mission, they had a very alien feel to proceedings through their design as well. Finally, I'd like to touch on the conclusion, by which I mean the last half or so of episode 12, which I think is honestly some of the most brutal stuff Doctor Who did in this decade. The Time Destructor, once activated, feels like an unstoppable force of nature. Sara's sudden and quite brutal death at its hands is quite an effective gut punch, and the Daleks being destroyed by a force of nature they wish to unleash but clearly would not have been able to control underscores their fatal weakness, the desire to conquest leading to overconfidence. The final scene where the Doctor and Stephen survey the damage and Stephen has to remind the Doctor of the loss they endured is also quite an effective moment, underscoring quite how much of an epic journey this has been and all that has been lost along the way. As a conclusion to such a story, I'd say it works quite well. So, that's what works about this. As for what doesn't, well, let's talk about the elephant in the room first, shall we? When I say this story is 12 episodes, I don't quite mean that. This story is actually 11 episodes, and 25 minutes of my life I'm never getting back. Episode 7, The Feast of Stephen, and frankly would have been more entertaining if it involved Stephen eating a well-prepared meal, was the episode broadcast on Christmas Day. It's amusing to compare New Who's Christmas specials, which have included 3 regeneration episodes and a whole host of absolutely vital plot developments, when considering the reason they made this episode would be what it is, a farce with no relation to the rest of the story, was because they were worried anyone not watching Christmas Day wouldn't be able to catch up. Now, to be honest, the most obvious solution here was just to say to the BBC, look, we'll take a 2-week break here, fill the slot with relevant tush, and we'll come back after Christmas. But if that truly wasn't an option, this part of the story is about the TARDIS being pursued by the Daleks, so just have it be a bit like The Chase, where there's just a bit of random adventures where they're being chased by the Daleks, then have an exposition bit at the start of episode 8 filling everyone in. God knows it wouldn't have been good, but at least would have been better than this. Now, my patience for stupid Doctor Who is not particularly high, but this surely must test even those who like Paradise Towers. It involves a police station in Liverpool and wacky antics involving Stephen dressing as a police officer, the Doctor being arrested for having the police box, and the most boring person on Earth talking about his shed being invaded by rebels or whatever the hell it is. Then there's a film studio in Hollywood with all the expected exaggerated American accents and hilarious chaotic slapstick that wouldn't have been out of place in the Marx Brothers film, except with them it might actually be funny. Frankly, I've had more entertaining blood tests than this, but what really takes the cake is that this is right in the middle of a life and death battle for the universe against the Daleks. Now, New Who I would expect to do stupid tonal mismatches like this, but it is out of place for the classic series and just doesn't work. It of course ends with the infamous scene where the Doctor wishes the audience a Merry Christmas, which is funny as a meme but still unbelievable anyone thought it was a good idea. The only good thing in the episode at all is this line.
Well, I suppose you might say that I am a citizen of the universe, and a gentleman to boot.
And I do like that, so there we are. One line in a 25-minute farce which has nothing to any proceedings at all. The worst thing is, because episode 8 was broadcast on New Year's Day, we have to do even more buggering around in case anyone missed that one as well, this time for a New Year's celebration, so there's even more utterly dead air. Well, that's that episode done. What about the other 11? Well, unfortunately, even the good parts of the story suffer from a problem that would be fairly predictable for a story at this length. It's padded to extreme degrees, and so much that is present is relevant filler. It's often remarked that you could simply cut the plotline with a fake Terranium and have the Dark Doctor give back the real core in episode 6 instead of episode 10, and you have an 8-parter instead while barely using anything or having to change anything else. But even then, the real way to cut this down is simply to go through and keep it far more tight and focused than it is. Frankly, I think if you cut out everything that doesn't matter and isn't needed for plot or character reasons, you get this down to 6 without much issue. Episodes 6 to 10 are pointless. They add nothing to the political intrigue plot, which is more or less dropped. It's just with Daleks chasing the TARDIS, which is old hat, and a few bits that do matter between the Daleks, Chen, and the delegates, and the character stuff with the TARDIS crew could probably be accommodated in reworked versions of episodes 5 and 11. Episode 6, for instance, is in 2 parts really. The escape from the invisible aliens, which again could have been cut easily, and then the sodding about with the fake core, which again could have been cut and just adds nothing. This doesn't show the Doctor being crafty and intelligent at all, he's just bothering about with technobabble. It requires Stephen of all people to act recklessly in a bizarrely out of character way, and Sara, who badly needed some development, gets none. In episodes 8 to 10, the monk turns up, who I just realised I hadn't mentioned yet, so yeah, the monk is in this. Why? Your guess is as good as mine. He at least has a bit of levity to episodes 9 and 10. Peter Butterworth is great, and there's a few small character bits between him and the Doctor, so I guess you can get that from it, but I still think the story would have been much better off without these bits. And in the end, the Doctor ends up giving them back the core as he would have done anyway. Grand. Even other parts of the story are suffering from this. Episode 1 has like a good 5 minutes, maybe closer to 10, of these characters we'll never see again chatting and talking about Chen, which establishes nothing about Chen that isn't relevant or isn't established later much more effectively through Chen's own actions and dialogue. Oh, and they also ignore Brett's very important message because they're incompetent boobs. So thanks for nearly destroying the Earth, idiots. The Prison Planet subplot in episode 3 has only one purpose, to kill Katarina, and I'll get to why I dislike that in a bit. And episode 5 has all the invisible alien stuff and the teleporting experiment and all that. Again, what does it add to the story of the Daleks' galactic domination and betrayal within Earth's government and all the delegates and stuff? The tightest episodes 2 and 4, which are probably the best of the lot, and that's because they feel like they move at the right place, every moment is relevant and matters. So many of the scenes later on just feel like utter dead air, and it kills so much promise from the story. I'm not going to think this is some incredible dark tale of conquest and intrigue when I'm bored listening to filler exposition. I also feel like the story suffers from some general structural and plot weaknesses brought on by the length. The pacing I've mentioned is not great. It feels like the political intrigue plot gets wrapped up way too quickly, while the chase plot just plods on and on, especially as I said, it's already been done. Even on an episode-by-episode basis it has issues though. Episode 5, and because it exists, it's a fair one to judge, just feels so drawn out. Even if we ignore how inconsequential how much of the plot is, it just repeats stuff and goes nowhere. There's only so many times you can listen to throwaway characters arguing about teleporting mice before you want to remove your own brain with an ice cream scoop. And the problem is, it feels like there isn't enough time for other important stuff as well. As I'll get to, Sara does not feel like a character get the character development she should in this extremely important episode for her, as it should just be the one that establishes her character and why she'd go from shooting her own brother to joining the Doctor within 25 minutes. But it's given no time because the episode is structured and paced just completely wrong. As for plot weaknesses, well, I'm afraid there are several. The time to structure, while a great and fairly terrifying abstract concept, and as well it's executed well in the production, but it is let down by the fact we never find out quite how the Daleks want to use it. Yeah, I know I did say conquest and devastation was enough, and it is. The problem is that once the thing is activated, it just goes out of control and destroys time, as is in the title, but that includes the Daleks. Which begs the question of what their plan of avoiding being destroyed by it themselves actually was. Equally, the nature of the structure is frustratingly vague, and you get the feeling a plan that involves a mineral that takes 80 years or however long it was to get a pretty small amount of it probably should be best to put as plan B or C in your take over the universe list. Another issue with the story is that of the companions. Now, Stephen is a companion I generally like a lot, and while he doesn't really undergo much of an arc in this story, the only really notable bit is him calling out the Doctor on not appreciating the lives lost, which leads into their confrontation at the end of the next story. I'd say he's still a solid character most of the times, and Peter Purves is always dependable. The issue is with the secondary characters that they choose to fill the other companion role. Brett Vion, played by Nicholas Courtney, and Sara Kingdom, played by Jean Marsh, are both Space Security Service agents who assist the Doctor. Brett appears in episodes 1 to 4, while Sara's in the rest. And unfortunately, while both characters have their moments, I think in the end their involvements are not successful. Ultimately, I think that these are two different characters is not necessary and is to the detriment of the story. Brett starts out as a hard, experienced agent who is initially antagonistic to the Doctor before learning the truth about the Daleks and switching to becoming his ally, where he maintains a ruthless streak but nevertheless believes in helping the Doctor. Sara starts out as a hard, experienced agent, to the point where she kills Brett, her own brother, who is initially antagonistic to the Doctor before learning the truth about the Daleks and switching to becoming his ally, where she maintains a ruthless streak but nevertheless believes in helping the Doctor. Yeah, I just don't see the point in having these as two separate characters. The only possible reason was to explore Sara's reaction and guilt to killing her own sibling as something she believed was necessary, but was quickly and horribly proven wrong. But nothing's done with it. There's one very quick scene where it's revealed that he was her brother, and then her turn to the side of the goodies is pretty much complete. It happened more or less instantly, without any real development or proof. Brett had a much more effective turn, as he wasn't as antagonistic to start with, and he gets much more solid proof of the Daleks' plans, so having that as the start of the character's story would have worked better, and because of the story structure, Sara gets very little time to properly develop. Her guilt over her actions barely come up again. She becomes just another companion character, happy to go around with the Doctor all too quickly. Personally, I think the Brett character should have been jettisoned, and Sara should have been in it from the start. It would have made her journey far more believable, and allowed for her to reach the point she does at the end of episode 5 in a much more natural fashion. I like Nicholas Courtney's performance, and some of the character stuff for Brett. He's a pragmatist but not an arsehole, and this is demonstrated several times. But let's be honest, Brett is a footnote to Courtney's legacy on Doctor Who, and the other stuff could quite easily have been adapted to Sara. I think having it structured in this way was a mistake. And then there is the other companion departure for the piece, Katarina. After Vicky's enforced departure, she came in the Mythmakers to replace her. Katarina is a very unique character, the handmaid of Cassandra of Troy, and one I deeply regret the course they took with. See, they decided very early on that Katarina would not work as a companion because of her unfamiliarity with modern concepts that would make it difficult to write for her. So she had to go early on in this story. Now, I will give them this. The decision to kill her was a bold one, and one that added serious dramatic weight not just to this story but to the show as a whole. It shows definitively for the first time that travelling with a doctor is dangerous, and there can sometimes be fatal consequences. The nature of her death also works very well, giving her life to save the others in a final demonstration of the faith the doctor had earned from her. The build-up to the death is the Blue Peter clip of episode 4 that exists, and it's a brilliantly tense scene, superbly acted by Peter Purves, whose final cry of her name is one of his best moments of his tenure. The Doctor's bitter, regretful monologue afterwards, where he essentially blames himself without outright saying that, is wonderfully performed by Hartnell, and while we can't see it, the idea of her body floating through space can be imagined simply from the haunting music. There are two problems with this though, and they severely dampen whatever good things come out of this scene. First, because of the structure of the story, after death, the things immediately have to go back to business as usual in fighting the Daleks, and Katarina is pretty much forgotten. The heartbreaking death of a woman who had been taken out of her own time, and someone who arguably the Doctor did let down, might as well not have happened. Only at the end does Stephen mention her death, but in the same breath as Brett and Sara. The difference is not highlighted that they, in the end, died in line of duty defending the Earth from invasion, whereas Katarina died an ultimately pointless death, away from her own time and her own home. Secondly, and more importantly, I think Katarina as a character was a sign of the cowardice Doctor Who production teams frequently engaged in, and in the end I think similar behaviour was part of the reason the show would eventually die the death it did 20 years later. Sure, they thought Katarina wouldn't work as a companion, but it feels like they never even tried. The first scene Adrienne Hill filmed in the role was the special effects of the floating in space part of her death scene. At no point was his companion given a chance to try and work. Sure, it would have been difficult, but there was so much potential here that it was completely wasted. In the end, it's not as if she would have been on her own. Stephen was a dependable character you could use to act as the audience surrogate as the companion should do. After all, he was there to replace both Ian and Barbara, and it's not as if Susan was intended for that role initially, so companions who didn't have that role was not unprecedented. For Katarina, why not try giving her a character arc? She goes from knowing nothing about the universe to learning and growing throughout the stories that followed under the Doctor's influence. She was not stupid, she was just out of time, and her changing as she discovered more and more about the time around her could have been a triumphant character arc. Let's assume that she leaves the TARDIS at the same point her eventual replacement Dodo did in the War Machines. She goes from thinking the TARDIS is a temple and the Doctor being a god, to being confident enough in her own growth to stay behind in contemporary London, with a new life and the Doctor happy in the knowledge that he saved her from the slaughter of Troy and allowed her to flourish in this new life. Obviously she'd need a better departure than Dodo actually got, but the point stands. Even in this story her worth could have been proven several times fighting the Daleks. Now obviously keeping her would have meant restructuring much of the story, but think about a few key moments. In episode 10 for instance, who's to say she couldn't have been with the Doctor throughout that episode, growing from his tutelage to be able to stand up to the evil ones as she called them just as effectively as he did in the actual story. And at the end, I think it would have been great if both Stephen and Sara were out of the TARDIS when the time destructor goes off, only for the former to be saved by Katarina, who's worked out perhaps from observing and listening to the Doctor the true danger of it. What particularly annoys me about this is that in the very next season, not just one, but two companions from Earth's past would join the TARDIS, and while obviously 18th century Scotland and 19th century England are much closer to the modern day than ancient Troy, the principle is the same. Jamie and Victoria were no more familiar with the modern day concepts than Katarina was, and yet the writers wrote around that and used what knowledge they did have to build their characters and experiences. Jamie was in fact quite similar to Katarina. Taken out of time, he was someone who needs to learn and build his experiences, but it ended up being something that he could do because he was far from unintelligent, and he ended up leaving the TARDIS a changed man, which is why it was all the more cruel the Time Lords took that away from him again. An arc like that was possible to do only a year later, so why was it beyond them now? And Katarina, and frankly Adrienne Hill, deserve better than this. It was a sign of maybe the problem with this story and that the production team of this time in a nutshell. Lots of epic Daleks were enough, and they were shying away from the true challenge of storytelling. As for this story's place in Doctor Who's culture, well, I think it's sadly fair to say that it is the least remembered Dalek story of the decade. You could blame that on it being missing, but then the power of the Daleks and the evil of the Daleks aren't exactly full and complete, are they? I struggle to believe it's just the telestamps that make this the case. No, I think it's more that this story in the end, it just doesn't really have much to say. It has some solid plots, of course, some interesting character work, a top quality villain, but unlike Power and Evil, which explored who the Daleks were, they're here to just be the baddies and that's it. I think that's the problem with this story in a nutshell. It has many elements that work, but I don't think they come together as well as they should because it is just the sum of its parts and nothing more. And I think in the end that came down to both too much ambition and not enough. Too much in having 12 episodes of something like this was never going to work, but not enough, and the elements were just left without development. The potential of Katarina was wasted. Sara was there to show off Jean Marsh and receive so little development as an actual character, and so much of the story is just plotting filler. There's a great deal of potential just isn't used. It's something, an achievement just to have a story this long, sure, but the thing I can't help thinking, in the end, the War Games is just 2 episodes shorter than this, and it's far more effective at using its time. It has much better pace, a stronger plot and structure, and some absolutely top quality character work. The War Games is one of Doctor Who's all-time classics, and this story, I'm afraid it's not. Whatever it gets right, it's just not a patch on it, and maybe it should have been. So, I've given much consideration to the final score, but I think I'm going to settle on a final score of 5 out of 10. It's obviously not a typical example of Classic Who, but I think it ends up as an average one. There's much to praise, a great villain, fantastic production and production values, a great story for the Doctor, and William Hartnell at his absolute best, but in the end, it struggles with its length, there's too much that's filler, and so much potential is underdeveloped and wasted. It's not helped at all by being mostly missing as it is, but in the end, I do have to review what's in front of me. It's a shame, but that's life. In the end, the average of Classic Who is a good one to hold up to, and this is far from a bad story. I think there's a lot to praise. If it existed, I'd probably recommend it, and I still would recommend watching the 3 existing episodes just to get a taste of the story, but sadly, I think this could have been a lot more.